The phone's ring pierced through my quiet evening like a siren. I glanced at the caller ID, my stomach instantly knotting when I saw it was my mother. The last few conversations with her had left me feeling hollow, but I answered anyway. Her voice came through unnervingly calm, almost rehearsed. "Rebecca, your father and I have made our final decision. We're giving everything to Melissa's children when we're gone. You've always been so independent, so successful on your own. You understand, don't you?" The words hung in the air between us. 38 years of being the dependable daughter, of swallowing disappointment, of nodding and smiling when I was crumbling inside. All of it crashed down in that moment. But habit is a powerful thing, so I heard myself saying, "Of course, Mom. Whatever you think is right." After I hung up, I sat motionless in my kitchen, staring at the rain streaking down my apartment windows. The Seattle skyline blurred through my tears as the truth I'd been denying for decades finally crystallized. In my parents' eyes, my success was my punishment. And in that moment, I decided it was time to rewrite the ending to this story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, I was always the smart one. That's how adults described me at family gatherings, with that particular tone that wasn't quite a compliment. My sister Melissa was the pretty one, the social butterfly, the daughter, whose laughter filled rooms and whose tears could melt our father's heart in seconds. I was the one with the straight A's, the perfect attendance, the college scholarships. Melissa was the one with the homecoming crown, the popular friends, and, later, the picture-perfect wedding. Our childhood home sat on a hill overlooking the Columbia River, a sprawling Tudor that had been in my father's family for generations. I can still picture every detail: the creaking third step on the staircase, the bay window in the library, where I spent countless hours reading while Melissa hosted parties in the backyard, the kitchen where my mother would sigh and say, "Rebecca, why can't you be more like your sister? People would like you more if you just smiled." I learned early that being reliable wasn't the same as being cherished. When I graduated top of my class in high school, my parents attended the ceremony but left early to make it to Melissa's dance recital. When I got into Yale on a partial scholarship and needed help with the remaining tuition, my father looked uncomfortable and said, "You've always been so resourceful, Rebecca. I'm sure you'll figure something out." That same year, they bought Melissa a car for her 18th birthday, a red convertible with a personalized license plate. I did figure it out. I worked 3 campus jobs, took out loans, and graduated with honors. I went on to get my MBA, landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm in Seattle, and climbed the corporate ladder with focused determination. By 35, I was a senior partner with a corner office overlooking Elliott Bay and a salary that allowed me to live in the exclusive Queen Anne neighborhood. I paid off my student loans, invested wisely, and built the financial security my parents had never provided. Melissa, meanwhile, married her high school sweetheart Dylan right after graduation. They had 3 children in quick succession: Ava, Ethan, and Lily. She never went to college, never held a job for more than a few months. Dylan worked for my father's real estate development company, always in mid-level positions that seemed to require frequent financial assistance from my parents. They lived in a house my parents purchased for them as a wedding gift, just 15 minutes from our childhood home. Family gatherings became increasingly predictable. Every holiday, every birthday, every summer barbecue followed the same script. Melissa's children would be lavished with attention and gifts. My parents would fuss over Melissa, asking if she needed anything, offering to take the kids for the weekend so she and Dylan could have some time to themselves. My father and Dylan would discuss business ventures that inevitably led to my father writing another check. And me? I was the audience. The reliable daughter who flew in from Seattle, brought expensive gifts no one quite appreciated, and listened to subtle comments about how my apartment must feel empty, how work couldn't keep you warm at night, how family was everything. "Have you met anyone special yet, Rebecca?" my mother would inevitably ask, eyebrows raised with a mix of hope and judgment. When I mentioned a promotion or a successful project, the response was always the same. A brief, "That's nice, dear," before turning back to Melissa's drama or the grandchildren's latest accomplishments. I built walls around my heart, brick by brick, year after year. I told myself I didn't need their approval or their money. I had colleagues who respected my intelligence, friends who appreciated my loyalty, a life that I had built on my own terms. I donated to charities, mentored young women in business, traveled to countries my family couldn't locate on a map. I was fine. I was successful. I was independent. But in quiet moments, in the space between waking and sleeping, the truth would slip through the cracks in those walls. It hurt. The way they looked past me at family gatherings, the Christmas gifts that showed how little they knew me, bath sets and scented candles for a woman who collected first edition books and took advanced pottery classes. The fact that they never once visited my home in Seattle despite my countless invitations. It all hurt in a way I couldn't articulate, even to myself. So when my mother called with her announcement about the will, something shifted inside me. It wasn't about the money, I had more than enough of my own. It was about what the decision represented. A lifetime of being overlooked, undervalued, and taken for granted. A final confirmation that in their eyes, my self-sufficiency was a reason to give me less, not more. After the call, I poured myself a glass of the expensive Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion. Special occasions are a myth we create to postpone living, I thought bitterly. I carried my wine to the window and watched the city lights flicker through the rain. Seattle had always understood me better than Portland ever had. A city of ambitious introverts, of coffee and books and meaningful conversations. A city where success wasn't something to apologize for. My condo took up half the top floor of an exclusive building on Queen Anne Hill. Floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors, a kitchen I rarely used to its full potential, walls adorned with art from local artists and souvenirs from my travels. It was beautiful, elegant, and mine. Every square inch paid for by my own work, my own choices, my own sacrifices. On my bookshelf sat a single family photo, my college graduation. My parents, standing stiffly beside me, already checking their watches because Melissa had called crying about some crisis with her boyfriend. That was the last time I had asked anything of them. The last time I had allowed myself to hope for their pride. I pulled out my laptop and began typing. If my parents thought they were making a statement with their will, it was time I made one, of my own. The next morning, I called my assistant and cleared my calendar for the next 3 days. Personal emergency, I explained, something I had never done in 7 years at the firm. Then I booked a flight to Portland. The rain followed me there, transforming the familiar landscape into something melancholic and fitting for my mood. I rented a car at the airport and drove to my childhood neighborhood, but instead of turning up the hill toward my parents' house, I headed for a coffee shop downtown where I'd arranged to meet someone. Carol Watson had been my mother's best friend since college, until a falling out 5 years ago that neither woman would discuss. She was waiting for me at a corner table, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob, her eyes sharp behind designer glasses. "Rebecca," she said, standing to embrace me. "You look exactly like your grandmother Elaine. She was a force too, you know." I had barely known my grandmother before she passed away when I was 10, but I'd always treasured the few memories I had. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she helped me with math homework, her quiet insistence that I should aim higher than anyone expected me to. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, settling into the chair across from her. Carol studied me for a moment. "Your mother called me yesterday, first time in years. She told me about their decision regarding the will." I felt my shoulders tense. And she wanted my approval. She didn't get it. Carol's directness had always been refreshing in a family that specialized in passive aggression. I told her she was making a mistake she'd regret when it was too late to fix it. Did she mention why they made this decision? I asked, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug. Carol sighed. Martha claims it's because you're so successful you don't need the inheritance. Melissa's children do. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But between us, I've known your mother since we were 18, and I know there's more to it than that. Like what? Your success makes her uncomfortable, Rebecca. It always has. You've achieved more than she ever dreamed of for herself. And instead of being proud, she's resentful. You remind her of choices she didn't make, paths she didn't take. I sat with that for a moment, letting the truth of it settle. And my father? Robert follows Martha's lead when it comes to the girls. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Always has. But she hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. This might interest you. Inside was a bank statement for an account I'd never seen before, in both my parents' names. The balance was substantial, over $3 million. Where did you get this? I asked, stunned. Your father left it at my house the last time they visited, before the falling out. I've held on to it, thinking it might be important someday. I studied the statement more closely and noticed something odd. A recurring monthly transfer to another account, labeled simply Our Fund. Do you know what this is? I asked, pointing to the entry. Carol nodded slowly. Your father mentioned it once. It's a trust fund he set up for you when you got into Yale. He told Martha it was a property investment to avoid an argument. He's been adding to it ever since, planning to give it to you when the time was right. My hands trembled slightly. A trust fund? For me? But they refused to help with my tuition. I worked 3 jobs. I took out loans that took years to pay off. Robert believed it would build character, Carol said, her tone making it clear what she thought of that logic. He wanted you to earn your success, to be independent. He thought if you knew about the money, it would change your drive. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. They had watched me struggle, had declined to help when I asked directly, all while secretly setting aside a fortune in my name. A fortune they had now apparently decided should go to Melissa's children instead. Does my father know about their decision to change the will? I asked. Carol shook her head. Your mother called me, not Robert. And knowing Martha, she's presented it to him as a decision they reached together, even if that's not entirely accurate. I carefully refolded the statement and placed it back in the envelope. Thank you for showing me this. What will you do now? Carol asked, her eyes kind but concerned. I smiled, a real smile that surprised even me. I'm going to visit my sister. Melissa's house was exactly what you'd expect. A spacious colonial in an upscale neighborhood, perfectly landscaped front yard, luxury SUV in the driveway. The kind of place that screamed comfortable upper middle class without any actual personality. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering my thoughts. I hadn't told her I was coming. We spoke on birthdays and holidays, exchanged perfunctory messages about family gatherings, but we hadn't had a real conversation in years. Not since her wedding, when she'd drunkenly admitted that she'd always been jealous of me. My intelligence, my independence, my ability to navigate the world without constant validation. But look how it turned out. She'd slurred, gesturing at her wedding gown, her handsome husband, the expensive reception our parents had paid for. Being the favorite is better than being the smart one. I had smiled and congratulated her again, but something had broken between us that night. A final acknowledgement that we were playing different games with different rules, and always had been. I rang the doorbell and heard the chaos within Children shouting, a dog barking, Melissa's voice calling out, "Coming!" When she opened the door, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to shock. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" Melissa still looked like the homecoming queen. Blonde hair highlighted to perfection, tasteful makeup, designer jeans, and a cashmere sweater. But there were new lines around her eyes, a tightness to her smile that hadn't been there before. "Can I come in?" I asked. "I think we need to talk." She hesitated, then stepped back. "Of course. Sorry about the mess. We weren't expecting company." The house was cluttered but lovely. Toys scattered across expensive rugs, family photos covering every surface, the smell of something baking in the kitchen. Her children appeared briefly, curious about the visitor, before Melissa shooed them upstairs. "Dylan's at work," she explained, leading me to the kitchen where she poured 2 glasses of iced tea. "Is everything okay? You never come here without calling first." I took a sip of tea, organizing my thoughts. "Mom called me yesterday. She told me about their decision regarding the will." Melissa's face flushed slightly. She looked down at her glass. "Oh. Did you know about it beforehand?" I asked. Keeping my tone neutral, she nodded slowly. "They discussed it with me last month. I told them it wasn't necessary, that you should get your share, but..." She trailed off, avoiding my eyes. "But what?" "But they insisted. Mom said you've always been the independent one, that you've built this amazing life without their help. She said my children would need the financial security more than you ever would." There was something in her voice, a note of resentment, perhaps, or uncertainty. I wondered suddenly if the golden child role had its own burdens, its own expectations and limitations. "Did you know about the trust fund Dad set up for me?" I asked, watching her carefully. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with genuine surprise. "What trust fund?" I explained what Carol had shown me, watching as Melissa's expression shifted from shock to confusion to something that looked almost like relief. "I always wondered," she said quietly when I finished. "There were comments Dad would make sometimes about how proud he was of you, but then nothing would come of it. It was like they had this split view of you, admiration and resentment all mixed together." "And you?" I asked. "What's your view?" Melissa looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "I was always jealous of you, Becca. You know that. You had this certainty about who you were, what you wanted. You never seemed to need anyone's approval." She turned back to me. "But the older I get, the more I realize what it must have cost you to always be the outsider in your own family." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in decades. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the sister I might have had if our parents hadn't pitted us against each other from the beginning, if they hadn't created roles for us that neither of us had chosen. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Melissa," I said. "I don't need Mom and Dad's money. I've built my own life, my own security." "Then why are you here?" she asked, genuinely curious. I smiled. "Because it's time to change the story, for all of us." That evening, I drove up the familiar hill to my parents' house. The rain had cleared, leaving the air fresh and the sunset visible over the Columbia River. My father answered the door, his surprise evident. "Rebecca, we weren't expecting..." Your mother's at her book club. Come in, come in." He led me into the study, the room that had always intimidated me as a child. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, the massive desk where he conducted business and made decisions that shaped our lives. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly stooped, his hair almost entirely gray now. "Can I get you something to drink?" he offered, already moving toward the crystal decanter of whiskey he kept on the sideboard. "No, thank you," I said, taking a seat in one of the leather armchairs. "I won't stay long. I just came to tell you something important." He settled into his chair behind the desk, eyebrows raised expectantly. Mom told me about your decision regarding the will, I began, watching as his expression shifted to discomfort. And I've also learned about the trust fund you set up for me years ago. His face paled slightly. How did you— That doesn't matter, I said gently. What matters is that I understand now. You've been proud of me all along, haven't you? But you never knew how to show it. His eyes, so like my own, filled unexpectedly with tears. You were always so capable, Rebecca. So independent. I didn't want to hold you back or make you dependent. I wanted you to build something for yourself. And I have, I agreed. But Dad, watching me struggle while secretly setting aside money, for me, wasn't helping. It was controlling. Just like changing your will now isn't about what I need or don't need. It's about continuing the same pattern we've been stuck in for decades. He started to protest, but I held up my hand. I'm not here to ask you to change your will back. That's your decision. I'm here to tell you that I've changed mine. I reached into my bag and pulled out the document my lawyer had drafted that morning, placing it on the desk between us. I've designated half of my estate to establish a scholarship fund for young women pursuing business degrees. The other half will be split between several charitable foundations I've worked with over the years. I paused, meeting his eyes directly. Nothing goes to you, Mom, Melissa, or her children. He stared at the document, then back at me. But why? Is this some kind of revenge? I shook my head. No, Dad. It's liberation, for all of us. You and Mom can give your money to whoever you want. I'm giving mine to causes I believe in, and in doing so, I'm stepping out of the role I've played in this family for too long. The reliable daughter, who will always understand, always accept, always put everyone else first. I stood, smoothing down my skirt. I love you, Dad. I always will. But I'm done trying to earn a place in this family that should have been mine from the beginning. I was almost to the door when his voice stopped me. The trust fund, he said, his voice unsteady. It's still yours. I never changed that designation. Your mother doesn't even know about it. I turned back, surprised. Why are you telling me this now? He looked suddenly older, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. Because you're right, about all of it. And I don't want to lose you, Rebecca. In that moment, standing in the study where I'd always felt like an intruder, I realized something important. Changing my will wasn't about punishing my parents or proving a point. It was about finally taking ownership of my own story, past, present, and future. You haven't lost me, Dad, I said softly. But things have to change. Real change. Not just words. I left him sitting there, staring at my will, and drove back to my hotel. In the morning, I would meet with my lawyer again, then fly back to Seattle. Back to the life I had built, the friends who valued me, the career I had earned through my own hard work and talent. My phone rang as I was packing my suitcase the next day. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. Your father told me you were in town, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. And about your visit yesterday. Yes, I replied simply. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its usual certainty. I don't understand why you're doing this, Rebecca. We were only thinking of what was best for everyone. No, Mom. You were thinking of what maintained the family dynamic you're comfortable with. Me as the self-sufficient outsider. Melissa as the dependent favorite. But I'm rewriting that story now. Another silence. Longer this time. Will you come to dinner before you leave, please? Your father and I. We need to talk to you. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the clean break I'd envisioned. But another part, the part that still hoped for reconciliation, for understanding, made me say, what time? That evening, I arrived at my parents' house to find not just them, but Melissa and her family as well. The children were subdued, picking up on the tension in the air. Dylan looked uncomfortable, my father anxious, my mother determined. Only Melissa seemed calm, greeting me with a genuine hug and whispering, "I'm glad you came." Dinner was a stilted affair, with forced small talk and careful avoidance of the elephant in the room. It wasn't until the children had been excused and we'd moved to the living room that my mother finally addressed the real reason for the gathering. "Rebecca," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your father and I have been talking. About the will, about everything." I waited, refusing to make this easier for her. "We've decided to revise our estate plan," she continued, "to split things evenly between you and Melissa." I shook my head. "That's not necessary, Mom. I meant what I said. I don't need your money." "This isn't about need," my father interjected. "It's about recognition, about acknowledging that both our daughters deserve our support, in whatever form that takes." Melissa leaned forward. "I told them the same thing this morning, Becca. This isn't fair to you. It never has been." My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I didn't realize. I didn't want to see how we were treating you differently. It was easier to tell myself you were fine, that you didn't need us, than to admit I didn't know how to connect with you." It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. Not an apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement, the beginning of understanding. "I don't want to change my will back," I said quietly. "The scholarships, the charitable foundations, those matter to me. They're the legacy I want to leave." My father nodded slowly. "We respect that. But we still want to make things right, in whatever way we can." My mother reached for my hand, something she rarely did. "Will you give us that chance, Rebecca? To try to be the parents you deserved all along?" I looked around the room, at my father's hopeful expression, my mother's tearful one, Melissa's supportive smile, at the family photos on the walls that told a story I no longer wanted to be part of, and the possibility of a new story we might write together. "I can't promise anything," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." As I drove back to Seattle the next day, the clouds broke open to reveal patches of blue sky. Not a complete clearing, but a hint of possibility. I thought about the call that had started it all, about my mother's words. "We're giving everything to Melissa's children." Those words had broken something inside me, the final straw after a lifetime of being overlooked, but they had also freed me. In changing my will that night, I hadn't just redirected my assets, I had reclaimed my worth. I had stopped accepting the role assigned to me and started writing my own story. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' decision to exclude me from their will had forced them to finally see me, not as the self-sufficient daughter who didn't need them, but as a woman who had spent her life seeking a validation they had withheld. And in that seeing, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new to begin. I didn't know if we could repair decades of misunderstanding in whatever time we had left. I didn't know if old patterns would reassert themselves, if disappointments would accumulate again. But I did know this. I was no longer waiting for their approval to determine my value. The trust fund my father had revealed remained untouched. I had no plans to access it, but its existence stood as a complicated testament to a father who had loved me in his own flawed way, even when he couldn't show it directly. As I crossed the bridge into Seattle, my phone chimed with a message from Melissa. "Thank you for being brave enough to change the story, for all of us." Perhaps that was the real inheritance. Not money or property or possessions, but the courage to break cycles, to speak difficult truths, to forge new paths. To recognize that sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't anger or acceptance, but the quiet, determined act of defining your own worth. I pulled into my parking garage, took the elevator to my condo, and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the space I had created for myself. My home, my life, my choices. The family photo on my bookshelf caught my eye. My college graduation, my parents standing stiffly beside me. I picked it up, studied it for a moment, then placed it in a drawer. Not throwing it away, but setting it aside to make room for whatever might come next. On the empty shelf, I placed a small potted plant, a gift from my assistant before I left for Portland. 4 new beginnings, the card had read. New beginnings indeed. Not because my parents had finally seen my worth, but because I had finally recognized it myself. 2 weeks after returning to Seattle, I found myself staring at my phone, thumb hovering over my mother's contact information. Our last conversation had ended with tentative promises of change, of trying to build something new from the wreckage of old patterns. But good intentions often crumble under the weight of ingrained habits, and part of me wondered if this fragile peace would hold. I placed the phone down and turned instead to the stack of applications on my desk. Candidates for the Rebecca Miller Scholarship for Women in Business, the fund I had established with a significant portion of my savings. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my parents had spent decades undermining my confidence, I was now in a position to support young women who reminded me of my younger self. Ambitious, driven, perhaps lacking the family support that might have made their journeys easier. My assistant Kim knocked lightly on my office door, interrupting my thoughts. "The board meeting starts in 15 minutes, she reminded me, and Carol Watson called again. She said it's important. I nodded, gathering my notes. Thanks, Kim. I'll call Carol back this afternoon. The quarterly board meeting proceeded as expected. Financial reports, strategic planning, the usual corporate choreography that had once been the center of my universe. But today, I found my attention wandering, my thoughts drifting back to Portland, to the conversation in my parents' living room, to Melissa's unexpected support. "Rebecca, your thoughts on the expansion proposal?" The chairman's voice pulled me back to the present. I straightened in my chair, quickly scanning the slide displayed on the screen. "The Asian market projections seem optimistic given the current trade tensions," I said, professional instincts kicking in. "I'd recommend a more conservative approach, perhaps focusing on strengthening our position in existing markets before committing to such a significant investment." The meeting continued, but something had shifted inside me. The career I had built, partly out of genuine ambition, partly to prove my worth to parents who never seemed to notice, suddenly felt different. Not less important, but perhaps less all-consuming. As if by confronting the family dynamics that had shaped me, I had created space for new perspectives, new priorities. When I returned to my office, I finally called Carol back. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me," she said, her voice warm with familiar directness. "Just busy," I replied. "How are things in Portland?" "Interesting," Carol said, drawing out the word. "Your father came to see me yesterday." That caught my attention. "My father? Why?" "He wanted to talk about you, actually, about the trust fund." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Seattle skyline. "What about it?" "He's concerned that you might misinterpret his intentions. He said you haven't touched the money, haven't even acknowledged it since you found out." "There's nothing to acknowledge," I said, more sharply than I intended. "He set aside money for me while watching me struggle. He could have helped when I actually needed it, but instead he decided to build my character by making things harder than they needed to be." Carol was quiet for a moment. "He made mistakes, Rebecca. Serious ones. But I've known Robert for 40 years, and I believe he genuinely thought he was doing what was best for you. By treating me and Melissa completely differently, by allowing Mom to favor her in every way that mattered." "I'm not defending his choices," Carol said carefully. "I'm just suggesting that there might be more to understand here. He asked me to give you something, a journal of his father's. He thought it might help explain some things." My grandfather had died before I was born. I knew little about him, except that he had built the family real estate business from nothing, that he had been stern and demanding, and that my father rarely spoke of him. "What kind of journal?" I asked. Curiosity piqued despite my resistance. "A personal one. Robert found it after his father died but never showed it to anyone. He said it helped him understand some things about his own upbringing, and he thinks it might do the same for you." I hesitated, torn between wanting to maintain the emotional distance I'd established and the pull of potential answers. "You can send it to my office," I finally said. "Actually, he asked if you might come back to Portland to get it. He said there are things he wants to show you, things that would be difficult to explain long distance." My immediate instinct was to refuse. I had a life here, responsibilities, a carefully constructed independence that felt newly precious after the recent upheaval. Going back to Portland so soon felt like risking the clarity I'd fought hard to achieve. But Carol, who had always seen more than most, seemed to read my thoughts through the phone. Sometimes understanding where we come from helps us see more clearly where we're going, Rebecca. And sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need our forgiveness. Not for their sake, but for our own. After we hung up, I sat motionless at my desk, watching the afternoon light shift across the skyscrapers outside my window. The Rebecca who had built this career, this life, would have dismissed the invitation outright. Too busy, too important, too determined to maintain emotional boundaries. But I wasn't entirely that Rebecca anymore. So I called Kim and asked her to clear my calendar for the coming Friday and the following Monday. "Personal days," I explained, using a phrase that would have been foreign to me just weeks ago. She raised her eyebrows but said only, "Of course, I'll reschedule your meetings." I booked a flight to Portland for Thursday evening, then turned my attention back to the scholarship applications, to the young women whose stories of determination against difficult odds resonated so deeply. Their faces looked back at me from attached photos, serious, hopeful, uncertain, yet determined. I wondered what family dynamics had shaped them, what invisible patterns they were trying to break or fulfill. The flight to Portland was short, but turbulent, matching my internal state as we descended through rain clouds toward the familiar landscape below. I had texted my father that I was coming, but asked to stay at a hotel rather than the family home, a small boundary I needed to maintain. He responded simply, "I understand. I'll pick you up at 10 tomorrow morning if that works for you." The hotel was sleek and anonymous, a corporate haven in downtown Portland far removed from the emotional landscape of my childhood. I ordered room service, reviewed work emails, and tried not to think about what tomorrow might bring. But sleep proved elusive, my mind circling through memories, questions, and the persistent worry that I was making a mistake by coming back so soon. Morning arrived with clearing skies and a text from my father. "On my way. Looking forward to seeing you." The formal politeness of it struck me as both touching and sad, a father approaching his daughter with the cautious courtesy of a business acquaintance. Perhaps we had never known how to communicate differently. He was waiting in the hotel lobby when I came down, looking somehow smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I was seeing him differently now. He stood when he spotted me, an uncertain smile crossing his face. "Rebecca, thank you for coming." The drive from downtown Portland to the Southwest Hills was quiet at first, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "I thought we'd go to Forest Park first, if that's all right with you. There's something there I'd like to show you before we look at Grandpa's journal." Forest Park, the sprawling urban wilderness on the northwest side of the city, had been a backdrop to my childhood, a place for weekend hikes and school field trips. But my father's tone suggested something more significant than a nostalgic visit. "That's fine," I said, watching the familiar streets pass by outside the window. We parked at one of the trailheads and set out along a path that wound beneath towering Douglas firs. The air smelled of damp earth and greenery, the sounds of the city fading behind us as we walked deeper into the forest. My father moved with purpose, clearly heading for a specific destination. After about 20 minutes, he veered off the main trail onto a narrower path that I didn't recognize. Through a break in the trees, I caught a glimpse of stone, what appeared to be a small structure of some kind. "What is this place?" I asked as we approached. "Most people don't know it's here," my father said, pushing aside a branch to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a stone bench beside what looked like a memorial plaque. "This is where your grandfather proposed to your grandmother back in 1945. After she died, he had this placed here. It's not an official park monument. He arranged it privately with someone on the park's commission." I stepped closer to read the plaque. "Eleanor and Richard Miller. A love story begins. May 12, 1945. "I never knew about this," I said, surprised. My father sat on the bench, gesturing for me to join him. "No one does, really. Not your mother, not Melissa. Just me. And now you." I sat beside him, wondering what this had to do with our current situation. My father seemed to gather his thoughts before speaking. "My father was a difficult man, Rebecca. Brilliant in business, absolutely driven, but emotionally limited. He built his company through sheer force of will during some very hard economic times. His own father had lost everything in the Depression, and that experience shaped him profoundly." He ran his hand along the smooth stone of the bench. "The only person who ever saw his softer side was my mother. With her, he was different, gentle, even vulnerable sometimes. But with me and my brother James, he was all expectations and criticism. Nothing was ever quite good enough." I listened quietly, seeing parallels that my father might not yet recognize. James was more like our mother, social, charming, people-oriented. I was more like Dad, analytical, focused on results. Dad was harder on me precisely because he saw himself in me. He pushed me relentlessly, while James got a much lighter touch. He sighed, looking up at the cathedral of trees surrounding us. When James decided to become a teacher instead of joining the family business, Dad didn't speak to him for nearly a year, but eventually he came around. He respected that James had chosen his own path and was excelling at it. "And you?" I asked. "I joined the business right out of college, as expected. Worked my way up, though everyone assumed my position was just nepotism. Spent years trying to prove myself worthy of the Miller name." His eyes met mine, recognition flickering between us. "Sound familiar?" I didn't answer, but we both knew it did. When Dad died, I found his journal in his study. Pages and pages about his fears, that he wasn't a good enough father, that he was too hard on me, that he didn't know how to express pride without seeming weak. He wrote about how much he admired my work ethic, my intelligence, my determination, all things he never said to my face. My father pulled a small leather book from his jacket pocket. And then I found this entry, written just a month before. He died. He opened the journal to a marked page and handed it to me. The handwriting was angular and precise, much like my father's own. "I've made so many mistakes with Robert, pushed when I should have supported, criticized when I should have praised. Seeing him with his girls reminds me of my own failings. The older one, Rebecca, has his same intensity, his focus. I worry he'll repeat my mistakes, demanding perfection from the child most like himself, while giving easier affection to the one who doesn't reflect his own struggles. How do I tell him not to make my mistakes without admitting how deeply I've failed him? Perhaps this bench, this place that only he knows about, will someday help him understand what I couldn't express. That love doesn't always look like we expect it to. and that our greatest fears are often reflected in those most like us. I read the words twice, feeling their weight settle into me. 3 generations of the same pattern, a cycle of missing what was right in front of us, of harshness born from fear rather than indifference. I handed the journal back to my father. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. He closed the book carefully. "Because I've been making the same mistakes he did. When you were growing up, I saw myself in you. Your determination, your self-reliance, your brilliance. And instead of celebrating those qualities, I worried about them. I worried you'd become too hard, too focused on achievement at the expense of connection. So I pushed you harder, thinking I was preparing you for the world, while sheltering Melissa because she seemed more vulnerable. You created a trust fund for me but wouldn't help with my tuition," I said, the hurt still fresh despite my new understanding. "You watched me work multiple jobs and take out loans while giving Melissa everything on a silver platter." He nodded, accepting the accusation. "I convinced myself it was for your own good, that you needed to learn self-reliance, to build your own path. But the truth is, I was repeating exactly what my father did to me, being hardest on the child who reminded me most of myself." We sat in silence for a few moments, the forest quiet around us except for the occasional call of a bird or rustle of leaves. Finally, my father spoke again. "I didn't understand what I was doing until I read your will, until I saw the pain behind your decision. It was like looking in a mirror, seeing exactly what my father had seen in me, what he'd tried to warn me about in his own way." He turned to face me directly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Rebecca. I'm not even asking you to change your will back. I just wanted you to know that when I set up that trust fund, when I pushed you so hard, it wasn't because I valued you less than Melissa. It was because I saw in you all the potential I never fully realized in myself, and I was terrified of failing you." The words settled between us, profound in their honesty. For the first time, I saw my father not as the remote authority figure of my childhood, or the manipulative parent of my adult understanding, but as a man shaped by his own wounds, trying and often failing to do better than his father had done. "Does Mom understand any of this?" I asked. He shook his head ruefully. "Your mother sees the world very differently. She responded to Melissa's needs because they were obvious, emotional, immediate, expressed through tears and disappointments. Your needs were harder to see because you learned early to hide them, to be stoic, to solve your own problems. By the time I realized what was happening, the pattern was set." "And now?" I asked. "What happens now?" My father looked out at the trees, considering. "Now we try to break the cycle. I've talked to your mother, really talked, not just skimmed the surface like we usually do. She's beginning to understand how we've hurt you, though it's difficult for her to accept. She sees her relationship with Melissa as nurturing rather than enabling." He turned back to me. "And I've decided to establish a scholarship fund similar to yours, focused on first-generation college students, the kind of support I should have given you when you needed it most." The gesture touched me unexpectedly. "That's a good idea," I said. "It was inspired by you," he admitted. "By the fund you created. When I saw that, I realized you'd already found a way to turn your hurt into something meaningful. It made me proud, though I had no right to that pride." We began walking back toward the main trail, the conversation shifting to my work, to the scholarship candidates, to more neutral territory. But something had shifted between us. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but understanding. A recognition of patterns larger than either of us. As we approached the car, my father said, "Your mother would like to see you, if you're willing. She's been cooking all morning, your favorites from when you were young." The thought of facing my mother, with her subtler forms of favoritism and her likely defensiveness, made me hesitate. But the morning's revelations had created an opening, a possibility I hadn't considered before. "I'll come for lunch," I agreed. "But I'd like to see Melissa this afternoon, if she's free." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "She'll be glad to hear that. She's been worried about you." The drive to my childhood home was easier than the silent journey earlier. We talked about neutral topics, changes in the neighborhood, a new development along the river, the unseasonably warm weather. Normal conversation, the kind strangers might have. But it was a beginning. My mother was waiting on the porch when we arrived, nervousness evident in her posture. She had always been the confident one, the social director of our family, the one who set the tone and expectations. Seeing her uncertainty was another shift in the family dynamics I had always taken as fixed and unchangeable. "Rebecca," she said, stepping forward to embrace me with uncharacteristic emotion. "I'm so glad you came." Lunch was surprisingly pleasant, focused mainly on my work in Seattle and the scholarship fund I had established. My mother asked questions that showed genuine interest rather than the perfunctory acknowledgments of the past. My father shared some stories about his own college years that I'd never heard before, humanizing him in ways that still felt new and slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't until we were having coffee in the living room that my mother finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how we treated you and Melissa differently," she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "At first, I was defensive. I told myself you were exaggerating, that all children think their siblings get preferential treatment." She looked up at me, her eyes revealing a vulnerability I'd rarely seen. But then I started really thinking about it, looking back at how things were. And I realized, you were right. It wasn't intentional, at least not consciously. But Melissa was always so needy. She required so much attention, so much reassurance, and you were so self-sufficient, so capable. It was easy to convince myself you were fine. "I wasn't fine," I said quietly. "I just learned early that showing need wasn't welcome." My mother winced visibly at that, but nodded. "Your father explained some things to me, about his own upbringing, about why he pushed you so hard. It helped me understand, but it doesn't excuse how we made you feel." She reached for a folder on the coffee table and handed it to me. "This is a copy of our revised will. We've divided everything equally between you and Melissa, as we should have done all along. You don't have to change your own estate plans. That's your decision entirely, but we needed to correct our mistake." I accepted the folder but didn't open it. "This isn't about money, Mom. It never was." "I know," she said, surprising me. "It's about value, about seeing you for who you are and celebrating that. Not just when it's convenient or when you've achieved something extraordinary, but every day, in all the ways that matter." Her understanding, partial but sincere, caught me off guard. I had expected justifications, perhaps tears and guilt-inducing emotional displays, but not this clear-eyed acknowledgement. "I can't promise I'll get it right immediately," she continued. "Old habits are hard to break, but I'm committed to trying, to seeing you, really seeing you, not just the successful businesswoman or the independent daughter, but all of you." The afternoon with Melissa was different, less emotionally charged but equally illuminating. We met at a cafe near her home, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in years. "The kids are disappointed they didn't get to see you," she said after we'd ordered. "Especially Ethan. He's got this school project about successful women in business, and he wanted to interview his super smart aunt." She smiled, something genuine in it. His words, not mine. I felt a twinge of regret at missing an opportunity to connect with my niece and nephews, children I barely knew despite their proximity. "Maybe next time I'm in town," I offered. "I'd be happy to talk with him." Melissa studied me over her coffee cup. "You seem different," she observed. "More present somehow. I considered this. I think I am. Confronting the family dynamics we grew up with. It's been clarifying, painful but necessary. For all of us, Melissa agreed. Dad told me about their decision to change the will, to split things equally. I want you to know I supported that completely. I always felt, not guilty exactly, but uncomfortable with how differently they treated us. You benefited from it, I pointed out, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. She nodded, acknowledging this truth. I did. And for a long time I accepted that as normal, even deserved. It was easier than questioning it, than recognizing what it must have felt like for you. We were silent for a moment, both reflecting on the patterns we had participated in, willingly or not. Do you ever wonder who we might have been to each other without their influence? I asked suddenly. If we had been allowed to just be sisters, without all the comparative judgment, the different expectations? Melissa's eyes widened slightly at the question. All the time, she admitted. Especially lately. I've always admired you, Becca. Your clarity, your independence, your ability to create exactly the life you wanted. But I never knew how to bridge the gap between us. I admired things about you too, I confessed. Your ease with people, your emotional openness. We could have learned from each other instead of being pitted against each other. We still could, Melissa suggested tentatively. It's not too late to try, is it? The question hung between us, heavy with possibility. Could we, at this late stage, redefine our relationship? Strip away the years of competition and resentment to find something authentic underneath? I'd like that, I said finally. I think it would take time, and probably some uncomfortable conversations, but I'd like to try. Relief washed over her face. Me too, more than you know. We spent the next hour really talking. About her, marriage, more complicated than the perfect facade suggested, about my career, more fulfilling but also more isolating than she had imagined, about our parents, their strengths and limitations clearer to both of us now, about the future, uncertain but perhaps more open than before. When we parted, she hugged me tightly. Don't be a stranger, she said. To any of us, but especially to me. We've lost too much time already. I drove back to my hotel as the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the familiar streets. Tomorrow I would fly back to Seattle, back to my carefully constructed life, but something fundamental had shifted. The walls I had built necessary protection for so long now seemed more like barriers, keeping others out but also keeping me contained. In my hotel room, I opened my laptop and pulled up the applications for the scholarship fund again. Young women with dreams and determination, many of them navigating family dynamics as complex as my own. I had established the fund partly as a response to my parents' favoritism, a way of redirecting my hurt into something constructive. But now I saw it differently. Not just as a reaction to my past, but as an investment in a different kind of future. I thought about the cycle my grandfather had recognized too late, that my father had repeated despite his awareness, that I had been at risk of continuing in my own way. The cycle of letting fear prevent connection, of protecting ourselves at the cost of truly living. My phone chimed with a text from my father. Thank you for today. Your grandfather would have been proud of who you've become. So am I. Simple words, the kind I had longed to hear for decades. They didn't erase the past or guarantee the future, but they created a bridge between what had been and what might still be. I began drafting an email to the scholarship committee, suggesting we expand the program to include mentorship opportunities, not just financial support. These young women needed more than money. They needed guides who understood their challenges and could help them navigate the complex terrain of ambition and connection, of independence and belonging. Outside my window, Portland sparkled with evening lights, the city of my childhood, transformed by time and perspective. In 2 days, I would return to Seattle, to the life I had built there. But I would return different. Still the driven, successful woman I had always been, but perhaps with new capacity for the connections I had denied myself for so long. My mother had said, "We're giving everything to your sister's children," and in that moment, I had felt erased, devalued, dismissed. Changing my will that night had been an act of self-preservation, of reclaiming my worth in the only way that seemed possible. But now I understood that my true inheritance wasn't property, or money, or even recognition. It was the clarity that came from breaking destructive patterns, the freedom that came from seeing the larger story we had all been caught in. It was the possibility of rewriting not just my will, but my understanding of family, of worth, of legacy. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass as I looked out at the city below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for both retreat and connection. But tonight, in this moment of clarity, I felt something I hadn't expected to find in returning to Portland. Not just understanding or even forgiveness, but a kind of homecoming to myself. The Seattle rain tapped against my office windows, creating a soothing rhythm as I reviewed the quarterly projections. 3 months had passed since my revelatory weekend in Portland, and while the fundamental shifts in my family dynamics remained, the day-to-day reality of my life had reclaimed its familiar pace. Emails demanded responses, meetings filled my calendar, decisions awaited my input, the machinery of corporate life continuing regardless of personal epiphanies. A light knock interrupted my concentration. Kim stood in the doorway, a curious expression on her face. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent. Says his name is Ethan Miller." I set down my pen, surprised. "Ethan? My nephew, Ethan?" Kim nodded, clearly intrigued by this unexpected visitor. "He said to tell you it's for his school project, but he wanted to surprise you." Ethan was 12, the middle child of Melissa's 3. I had seen him briefly during my last visit to Portland, but hadn't had a real conversation with him in years. What was he doing in Seattle on a Thursday afternoon? "Send him in," I said, quickly clearing some space on my desk. Ethan entered tentatively, a lanky preteen with his father's height and Melissa's expressive eyes. He carried a backpack and what appeared to be recording equipment, a small digital recorder and a notebook. "Aunt Rebecca," he said, his voice caught between childhood and adolescence. "I hope it's okay that I came without calling first. Mom said you might be too busy if I asked ahead of time." I gestured for him to take a seat. "Of course it's okay. But how did you get here? Is your mother with you?" He shook his head, pride evident in his expression. "I took the train by myself. Mom drove me to the station in Portland this morning, and Uncle James is picking me up at the station here later." He glanced at his watch. "I have 3 hours before I need to head back." Uncle James, my father's younger brother, the teacher who had chosen his own path rather than joining the family business. I hadn't seen him in years, but apparently he was part of this unexpected excursion. "That's quite an adventure for a school project," I observed. "Must be an important assignment." Ethan nodded eagerly. "It's for the Young Entrepreneurs Program. We're supposed to interview someone who built their own career and then create a presentation about their path to success. Most kids are just interviewing their parents or using famous people from books, but I wanted to interview you." He looked down slightly, suddenly shy. "Mom says you're the smartest person she knows." The comment caught me off guard. Melissa. And I had spoken several times since my visit, brief calls that were still finding their way toward a new kind of sisterhood. But she had never expressed such straightforward admiration to me directly. "Well," I said, regaining my composure, "I'm honored you chose me. What would you like to know? For the next hour, Ethan asked surprisingly insightful questions about my education, my career choices, the challenges I'd faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry. He recorded my answers and took careful notes, his focus absolute. I found myself speaking with more candor than I might have with an adult interviewer, something about his earnest curiosity breaking through my usual professional reserve. "Did you always know what you wanted to do?" he asked toward the end of our session. "Mom says she never really figured that out. That's why she tried so many different things." I considered my answer carefully. I knew I wanted financial independence very early, and I discovered I had an aptitude for business, for strategy. But knowing what you want to do isn't the same as knowing who you want to be, Ethan. I focused so much on achievement that I sometimes lost sight of other important things. "Like what?" he pressed, pencil poised. "Like connections, family, taking time to enjoy the journey instead of just focusing on the destination." I gestured toward the view outside my window. I've lived in Seattle for 15 years, and there are still parts of the city I've never explored because I've been too busy working. Ethan considered this solemnly. "Do you regret it? Working? So hard?" The question, so direct, so unencumbered by adult politeness, deserved an honest answer. Not exactly regret, no. The work itself has been fulfilling, and it's given me freedom and security. But I regret letting work become my entire identity, letting it be the only measure of my worth. I smiled at him. There's a balance that I'm still learning to find. He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. That's what Grandpa says too. That he spent too much time at the office when Dad and Aunt Melissa were little, and now he's trying to make up for it. He glanced down at his notes. "Is that why you started the scholarship thing? To help other people find balance?" Again, his perception surprised me. "Partly," I acknowledged. "I want to help young women have opportunities, but also to recognize their value beyond just achievement. It's something I wish I'd understood earlier." When our interview concluded, I offered to show Ethan around the office before he had to leave. As we walked through the sleek corridors, introducing him to curious colleagues, I felt a strange pride, not in my professional surroundings, but in this thoughtful young person who had taken such initiative. "You know," I said as we waited for the elevator, "next time you could stay longer. See more of Seattle. You could even stay at my place if your parents are comfortable with that." His face lit up. "Really? That would be awesome. I've only ever seen the train station and the Space Needle once when I was little." The elevator doors opened, revealing Kim with a stack of folders. "Your 3 o'clock is waiting in the conference room," she reminded me, "and these need your signature before end of day." I glanced at Ethan, caught in the familiar pull of professional obligation. But something in his expression, a flicker of disappointment quickly masked, made me pause. "Kim, could you reschedule the 3 o'clock? And I'll sign those later this evening. I'm going to take my nephew to see the Pike Place Market before his train." Kim's surprise was evident, but quickly replaced with an approving smile. "Of course, I'll take care of it." Ethan's expression was worth whatever complications my schedule change might create. "Are you sure? I don't want to mess up your work stuff." I pressed the lobby button. "I'm sure. The CEO gets to make her own schedule sometimes. That's one of the perks of all that hard work." The afternoon at Pike Place Market, watching Ethan's fascination with the fish throwers, guiding him through the labyrinth of local vendors, sharing hot chocolate at a small cafe overlooking the water, was the most unplanned, unproductive, and unexpectedly delightful few hours I had experienced in longer than I cared to admit. When I finally delivered him to Uncle James at the train station, I found myself facing another ghost from my past. James Miller had aged well, his academic lifestyle evident in his casual dress and the reading glasses perched atop his head. He embraced me warmly. "Rebecca, it's been too long." Uncle James, thank you for being part of Ethan's grand adventure. He smiled, glancing at his great-nephew who was excitedly recounting our market excursion to another traveler. It wasn't entirely his idea, to be honest. Melissa called me last week, said Ethan wanted to interview you but was nervous about approaching the big-shot CEO aunt directly. I offered to help with the logistics. His expression grew more serious. Your father called me too, you know. First time in years. Told me about your visit, about the revelations regarding his parenting, about the parallels with our own father. He shook his head slightly. It seems you've catalyzed quite the family reckoning, Becca. I hadn't been called Becca by anyone except Melissa in decades. Coming from Uncle James, it transported me back to childhood visits when he would arrive, with books that were too advanced for me, but that he thought I might enjoy anyway. He had been the only adult who had never seemed surprised by my capabilities, who had treated my intelligence as natural rather than remarkable. It wasn't intentional, I admitted. I just finally reached my breaking point. Sometimes that's what it takes. Your grandfather reached his breaking point with me when I chose teaching over the business. We didn't speak for nearly a year. He glanced at Ethan, now examining the train schedule. But eventually he came around, admitted he'd been wrong, to try to force me into a mold that didn't fit. Your father never quite managed that level of self-reflection, at least not until you forced the issue. The station announcement system called Ethan's train for boarding. James squeezed my shoulder lightly. Don't be a stranger, Rebecca. Some family bonds are worth rebuilding. As I watched their train pull away, I felt an unexpected lightness. The afternoon's deviation from my carefully managed schedule hadn't resulted in disaster. The world continued turning despite my brief absence from the office. And somewhere in Portland, my sister would be waiting for her son's excited recounting of his day with the aunt he barely knew but had sought out anyway. I returned to my office to sign the documents Kim had left and address the most urgent emails before heading home. As I worked, my thoughts kept drifting to Ethan's questions, particularly his inquiry about regret. Did I regret the choices that had shaped my life? The singular focus on career advancement? The emotional walls I had built? The relationships I had deemed secondary to professional achievement? The question followed me home to my elegant but impersonal condo. Looking around, at the pristine space, beautiful but bearing little evidence of a life fully lived, I realized that something needed to change. The family revelations had started a process, but it remained incomplete. I had recognized the patterns that had shaped me, had begun rebuilding connections with my parents and Melissa, but my daily life remained largely unchanged. That evening, I did something unprecedented. I opened my calendar and blocked off every Friday afternoon for the next 6 months as personal time. No meetings, no calls, no emails. Just space to explore my city, to read something other than business reports, to simply exist without producing or achieving. The following week brought an unexpected invitation, an email from my mother with the subject line, "Family dinner?" The body contained a tentative suggestion. Rebecca, your father and I are coming to Seattle next weekend for the symphony. We thought perhaps we might take you to dinner on Saturday evening, if you're available. Nothing formal, just a chance. To continue our conversation from your last visit. With love, Mom. The signature caught my attention immediately. Not Mother, her usual formal closing, but Mom, a small but significant shift. I replied with a simple acceptance and found myself actually looking forward to their visit, a novel sensation when it came to family interactions. They arrived on Saturday looking somewhat out of place in my building's sleek lobby. My father in his golf sweater, my mother clutching her structured handbag, both of them examining the modern art installation with polite bewilderment. For the first time, I saw them clearly as they were. Not the outsized figures of my childhood grievances, but simply aging parents trying, belatedly but sincerely, to bridge the gap they had helped create. Your building is lovely, dear, my mother offered as I approached. Such a beautiful view of the water. Thanks, Mom. I thought we might have a drink here before dinner, if that works for you. There's a residence lounge on the top floor. The lounge was mercifully empty, allowing us to sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. As we sipped our drinks, my father broached the subject I sensed had been on his mind. Ethan hasn't stopped talking about his visit with you, he said. Melissa says he's rewritten his project 3 times to get it just right. He's a remarkable kid, I replied. Smart, curious. Actually listens when you answer his questions. My mother smiled tentatively. He gets that from you, I think. You were always such a good listener. Even as a little girl, you would sit so still, absorbing everything around you. The observation, a simple acknowledgement of a quality I'd possessed that had nothing to do with achievement, felt significant. I don't remember you noticing that, I said, not accusingly, but curiously. Her smile faltered slightly. I noticed more than I commented on, I'm afraid. It was easier to focus on the things that needed correction or improvement. She hesitated, then added, That was how I was raised. My mother never saw the point in praising what came naturally or was expected. Another generational pattern revealed. My grandmother's influence on my mother passed down to her relationships with her daughters. I had never considered that my mother might have been shaped by her own childhood wounds just as my father had been. Melissa mentioned you've invited Ethan to stay with you sometime, my father said, changing the subject slightly. That's wonderful. He could use a strong role model like you. I've been thinking about that, I replied. Not just Ethan, but all 3 kids. I barely know them, and that's partly my fault. I've kept myself so separate from family life, so focused on my career, that I've missed watching them grow up. It's not too late, my mother offered gently. Children are remarkably adaptable, and they're at interesting ages now, forming their own identities, asking big questions. We continued this surprisingly comfortable conversation through dinner, at a waterfront restaurant I had chosen for its excellent seafood. For the first time in memory, my parents asked questions about my life that went beyond professional achievements. About my friends in Seattle, my interests outside of work, places I had traveled that had meaningful impact. Simple questions that revealed how little they actually knew about me as a person, rather than as an achievement machine. As we waited for dessert, my mother reached into her purse and withdrew a small box. We brought you something, she said, sliding it across the table. Not for any special occasion, just because. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a simple lighthouse charm. I looked up, questioning. You probably don't remember. My father explained. But when you were very small, 4 or 5, we took a family trip to the Oregon coast. There was a lighthouse there that fascinated you. You asked dozens of questions about how it worked, why it was necessary, who maintained it. The guide was so impressed with your curiosity that he gave you special permission to climb all the way to the top. My mother continued the story. When we got to the top, you looked out at the ocean and said something we never forgot. You said, "It's important to help people find their way home safely, even when there's a storm." The memory surfaced slowly, the spiral staircase, the dizzying height, the powerful beacon that could cut through fog and darkness. I don't remember saying that, I admitted. Well, you did, my mother said, and your father and I were talking recently about how fitting it is, that you've always been a lighthouse in your own way. Strong, reliable, illuminating the path forward. We just failed to appreciate how special that was. I ran my finger over the small silver lighthouse, unexpectedly moved by the gift and the memory it represented. Not an expensive piece of jewelry or a status symbol, but something that acknowledged a quality I had possessed since childhood, one that had nothing to do with grades or achievements or financial success. Thank you, I said simply. This means a lot. The evening concluded with tentative plans for a longer visit in the summer, perhaps a week at the coast. recreating that long-ago family trip, but with new understanding and expectations. As I watched my parents' taxi pull away from the restaurant, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The weight of resentment I had carried for so long had lightened, replaced not with forgetting, but with something more complex. A compassionate understanding of the flawed, wounded people who had raised me as best they could with the emotional tools they possessed. The following Friday afternoon, my newly designated personal time, I decided to visit a small art gallery in a neighborhood I rarely frequented. The exhibition featured local artists exploring themes of family, memory, and identity through various media. I moved slowly through the space, allowing myself to simply experience the art without analysis or judgment. A novel approach for someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating, assessing, and strategizing. Rebecca? Rebecca Miller? I turned to find a woman about my age approaching, her expression warm with recognition. It took me a moment to place her. Then memory clicked into place. Hannah Lawson, from Yale. She beamed, clearly pleased to be remembered. Yes, it's been 15 years? I heard you were in Seattle but never seemed to run into you at any of the usual business functions. Hannah had been one of my few close friends in college, a brilliant literature major with a quick wit and a talent for drawing me out of my intense study sessions for occasional adventures. We had lost touch after graduation when our paths diverged, she to pursue a writing career, me to business school and the corporate ladder. I tend to keep a low profile outside of work, I admitted, but I'm trying to change that. Explore more, experience more. Well, this is a perfect place to start, she said, gesturing to the exhibition. My partner is one of the artists. That's why I'm here. Moral support for opening night. She led me to a series of mixed media pieces combining photography, text, and found objects. The artist's name, Claire Bennett, was unfamiliar to me, but the work itself was striking. Explorations of family dynamics across generations, the visible and invisible inheritances that shape identity. These are remarkable, I said honestly. There's something so familiar about them, even though they depict experiences I've never had. Hannah smiled proudly. That's Claire's gift, finding the universal in the specific. She says all families have their own mythology, their own unspoken rules and roles. She glanced at me curiously. How's your family, by the way? I remember you didn't talk about them much in college. The question would have triggered deflection just months ago, but now I found myself sharing a condensed version of recent events. My mother's phone call, my changed will, the subsequent revelations and tentative reconciliations. Hannah listened with the same attentive presence I remembered from college. That's quite a journey, she said when I finished. Speaking your truth after all those years must have been both terrifying and liberating. It was, I agreed, and it's still unfolding. I'm learning that changing long-standing patterns takes more than one conversation or revelation. Come meet Claire, Hannah suggested. I think you two would have an interesting conversation about family dynamics and reinvention. The introduction led to drinks after the exhibition closed, which extended to dinner at a small neighborhood restaurant I'd never noticed despite having lived in Seattle for years. Claire and Hannah were easy company, asking thoughtful questions, sharing their own stories of family complexities, laughing at the universal absurdities of parent-child relationships. For the first time in recent memory, I found myself in a social situation that had nothing to do with networking or professional advancement, simply human connection based on shared experiences and genuine interest. As we parted, Hannah hugged me warmly. Let's not wait another 15 years, okay? Claire and I host a monthly dinner for friends. Nothing fancy, just good food and conversation. You should join us next time. I found myself accepting without hesitation. I'd like that. Thank you. Walking back to my car, I realized that the evening represented exactly the kind of connection I had been denying myself for years. The messy, unproductive, deeply satisfying engagement with other lives and perspectives that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet or performance review, but that made life richer, fuller, more dimensional. The following week brought an unexpected development at work, an offer to lead a new international division of the company based in Singapore. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I would have jumped at without hesitation in the past. Prestigious, challenging, a clear step up the corporate ladder. The old Rebecca would have seen it as validation, another achievement to fill the void left by parental approval. But as I sat in the CEO's office listening to the proposal, I found myself asking questions I had never prioritized before. What would this mean for the nascent reconnections with my family? For the scholarship program I had established? For the small but meaningful changes I had begun making in my daily life? It's a tremendous opportunity, of course, I said carefully, but I'd like some time to consider it. The CEO looked surprised. I had always been the executive who moved fastest, decided quickest, executed most efficiently. Of course, he agreed. Take the weekend. We can talk on Monday. I spent that weekend in deep reflection, walking Seattle's neighborhoods, sitting in small cafes with a journal, really seeing the city I had lived in but rarely experienced fully. On Sunday, I called Melissa. An international position, she mused after I explained the situation. That sounds exciting, but also far away. That's what I keep thinking, I admitted. Just when I'm rebuilding connections here, this opportunity to leave presents itself. The timing feels significant somehow. What does your gut tell you? She asked. A simple question that I realized I rarely consulted. My decisions had always been analytical, strategic, measured against external metrics of success and advancement. My gut is surprisingly conflicted, I replied honestly. The professional challenge appeals to me, but the personal cost seems higher than it would have before. Melissa was quiet for a moment before responding. You know, Becca, one thing I've always admired about you is your clarity. When you know what you want, you go after it without hesitation or apology. Maybe the conflict you're feeling is just a sign that what you want has expanded to include more than professional achievement. Her insight struck me as profound in its simplicity. What I wanted had indeed expanded, not replacing career ambition, but contextualizing it within a broader vision of a well-lived life that included family connections, friendships, community engagement, and personal growth. When did you get so wise? I asked, only half joking. She laughed. Probably around the time I stopped defining myself solely as your counterpoint. It's liberating to just be Melissa, not the sister who married young and never had a career. Another realization, just as I had been shaped by being cast as the achiever, Melissa had been equally constrained by her complementary role. We had both been participating in a narrative neither of us had authored. Whatever you decide about Singapore, she continued, know that we'll work to maintain this connection we're rebuilding. Distance doesn't have to mean disconnection. Not anymore. Monday morning arrived with clarity. I declined the Singapore position, proposing instead an alternative structure that would allow me to lead the initiative remotely while remaining based in Seattle. It was a solution that would have been unthinkable to me before, prioritizing personal considerations alongside professional ones, seeking balance rather than single-minded advancement. To my surprise, the CEO was receptive. To be honest, he confided, we were concerned about losing your local knowledge and connections if you relocated entirely. This hybrid approach might actually serve everyone's interests better. That evening, I added another change to my evolving life. I signed up for a pottery class, something I had been curious about for years, but had always deferred as impractical or unproductive. The first session was scheduled for the following week, directly after work on Wednesday. Prime productive hours I was now willingly dedicating to something with no professional application whatsoever. As I confirmed my registration, my phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line read simply, Thank you. It was from one of the scholarship recipients, a young woman named Zoe who had just completed her first semester at business school. Ms. Miller. I wanted to express my deepest gratitude not just for the financial support of your scholarship program, but for the mentorship component you recently added. My advisor, Ms. Chen, has been an incredible resource and sounding board as I navigate the often overwhelming world of business education. What's meant the most to me, though, was something she told me came directly from you. That success isn't just measured by achievements or accolades, but by the connections we maintain, the balance we create, and the difference we make in others' lives. I come from a family where professional success was the only metric that mattered. Your program is helping me build a different kind of foundation, one where excellence and connection coexist rather than compete. Thank you for modeling this integrated approach to success. I hope to have the opportunity to thank you in person at the foundation dinner next month. With sincere appreciation. Zoe Hernandez. I read the email twice, struck by the parallels to my own experience, and moved by the possibility that my own hard-won insights might help another young woman avoid some of the pitfalls I had encountered. The scholarship program, born initially from hurt and defiance, had evolved into something more meaningful than I had anticipated, a way of transforming my personal narrative into a resource for others. That night, I added a new item to my will, a significant expansion of the scholarship fund, along with specific provisions for continued mentorship programs. But unlike my first revision, made in anger and pain after my mother's devastating phone call, this change came from a place of possibility and connection rather than rejection. The coming months would bring more changes, more adjustments, more opportunities to redefine success on my own terms. The process of unlearning decades of conditioning wouldn't be linear or simple. Old habits of overwork and emotional isolation would resurface. Newly established boundaries would be tested. The temptation to retreat into familiar patterns would arise in moments of stress or uncertainty. But something fundamental had shifted. The call that had once felt like the final confirmation of my expendability, "We're giving everything to your sister's children," had ultimately become the catalyst for claiming something far more valuable than an inheritance. My authentic self, freed from the constraints of others' expectations and limitations. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I caught sight of the silver lighthouse bracelet on my nightstand, a reminder of the child I had been, the values I had recognized even then, and the adult I was still becoming, someone capable of helping others navigate difficult waters while also finding my own way home. 18 months had passed since that pivotal phone call from my mother. Seasons had changed, relationships had evolved, and life had developed a rhythm I wouldn't have recognized 2 years ago. The pottery class I had impulsively signed up for had become a regular part of my weekly routine, a 3-hour window where strategy and spreadsheets yielded to clay and creativity. My growing collection of imperfect but earnest ceramic pieces now adorned my once pristine shelves, tangible evidence of my willingness to value process over perfection. On this particular Sunday morning, I stood in my kitchen waiting for the coffee to brew, surveying the chaos around me. Sleeping bags were still unrolled in the living room, remnants of popcorn scattered across the coffee table, a half-completed board game abandoned on the floor. My niece Lily and her 2 cousins had spent the night, the third such Seattle adventure weekend I had hosted in the past year. At 12, 9, and 7, they brought an energy to my ordered space that had once been unthinkable but now felt strangely essential. I heard giggling from the guest bathroom, followed by Lily's authoritative voice. "You have to use the fancy soap, Ethan. Aunt Becca says it's made by actual French people." The sound of my doorbell interrupted whatever lesson in luxury toiletries was underway. I opened the door to find Hannah and Claire right on time for our planned brunch. "We come bearing reinforcements," Hannah announced, holding up bags from the bakery down the street. Figured you might need extra fuel for the small. Humans. Claire surveyed the apartment with amusement. Wow. This place has undergone quite the transformation since we were here for dinner last month. She wasn't wrong. My once minimalist condo now contained evidence of a life being actively lived. Books left open mid-read, plants in various stages of thriving or struggling, photos from recent gatherings, even a small easel in the corner where I had tentatively begun exploring painting. The pristine showcase had become a home. The children emerged from the bathroom, faces freshly scrubbed and hair attempting to defy gravity despite obvious efforts to tame it. 7-year-old Sophie spotted the bakery bags immediately. "Are those the cinnamon rolls from Milo's?" she asked, eyes wide with anticipation. "The ones with extra frosting?" "The very same," Hannah confirmed, handing over the bags while receiving an enthusiastic hug in return. As we settled around the dining table, adults with coffee, children with hot chocolate, Ethan suddenly remembered something important. "Aunt Becca, we need to practice my presentation again before Mom and Dad pick us up. The science fair is on Tuesday." I nodded solemnly, acknowledging the gravity of this obligation. "Absolutely. Right after breakfast. Your visual aids are all packed in that blue folder." Lily rolled her eyes with the particular exasperation reserved for preteen girls referring to younger siblings. "He's been practicing it constantly, even in the car on the way here. Mom threatened to leave him at a rest stop." "It's an important project," I said, catching Ethan's momentary flash of hurt. "And your brothers worked really hard on it. Besides, I seem to remember someone practicing their dance recital routine in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner last year." Lily blushed but grinned, acknowledging the truth of this observation. As breakfast progressed, the conversation flowed, easily between adult topics and children's interjections. Hannah and Claire had become regular fixtures in my expanding social circle, their warmth and authenticity a welcome counterbalance to the more strategic relationships of my professional world. They treated the children with the same respectful attention they gave adults, asking thoughtful questions about their interests and listening to the answers with genuine curiosity. "So the foundation dinner is next weekend," Claire mentioned, as we cleared the breakfast dishes. "Have you finalized your speech?" I grimaced slightly. "Almost. It's challenging to strike the right tone, personal enough to be authentic, but not so personal that it becomes uncomfortable for the audience." The annual dinner for my scholarship foundation had evolved into a significant event, bringing together recipients, mentors, donors, and community partners. This year marked a particular milestone, the expansion of the program to include a dedicated mentorship network and summer internship opportunities. "Just tell the truth," Hannah suggested, "about why you started it, how it's evolved, what you hope it will become. Your story resonates because it's real. The achievement-oriented executive who discovered there's more to life than professional success." "That makes me sound like a character in a Hallmark movie," I protested, though without real annoyance. "More like someone who had the courage to examine her life and make meaningful changes," Claire corrected. "That's a lot harder than most people realize." Our philosophical discussion was interrupted by Ethan tugging at my sleeve. "I'm ready to practice now," he announced, folder clutched importantly against his chest. I excused myself to fulfill my aunt duties, following him to the living room where he had already begun setting up his presentation, a remarkably sophisticated exploration of renewable energy sources for elementary students. As he walked through, his talking points with endearing seriousness, I marveled at how completely my relationship with Melissa's children had transformed in such a relatively short time. 18 months ago, they had been virtual strangers, children I saw at obligatory family gatherings, gave impersonal gifts to on birthdays and holidays, knew little about beyond their names and ages. Now they had their own dedicated drawer. In my guest room, favorite mugs in my kitchen cabinet, and a growing list of Seattle traditions they insisted on maintaining with each visit. Ethan reached the conclusion of his presentation, looking up at me expectantly. "So, what do you think? Did I remember everything?" "It was excellent," I assured him. "Your explanation of how solar panels work was especially clear. I have only one suggestion. Slow down a little during the section about hydroelectric power. You've got great information there, but you're rushing through it." He nodded seriously, making a note in the margin of his index cards. "Mom said the same thing. I get excited and talk too fast." "It's good to be excited about your subject," I told him. "Just remember to bring your audience along with you." The doorbell rang again, signaling the arrival of Melissa and Dylan to collect their children. The ensuing chaos of gathering belongings, locating misplaced socks, and packing overnight bags was now familiar. A stark contrast to the ordered solitude that had once defined my weekends. Melissa hugged me warmly as the children loaded their bags into the elevator under Dylan's supervision. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "They look forward to these weekends for weeks." "So do I replied, realizing the simple truth of it. "They're remarkable kids, Mel. You've done an amazing job with them." Her expression softened at the use of her childhood nickname. "It's easier now, with things more balanced at home. Dylan's new position has been good for him. More responsibility, but also more recognition." She hesitated before adding, "Mom mentioned you're bringing someone to the family reunion next month?" I felt a flush of embarrassment and pleasure at the question. "Yes, his name is Daniel. We've been seeing each other for about 4 months." "The professor you met at that charity auction?" I nodded, still somewhat amazed at this development in my personal life. Daniel taught environmental law at the university. Brilliant, kind, with a wry sense of humor and a patience that balanced my more intense nature. Our relationship had developed slowly, deliberately, neither of us interested in rushing what felt increasingly significant. "I'm looking forward to meeting him," Melissa said, her expression warm with genuine happiness for me. "Mom's beside herself with excitement, of course. I think she's already mentally planning a wedding." I rolled my eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "Of course she is. I've told her repeatedly that we're taking things slowly, but subtlety has never been her strong suit. Especially now that she's embraced her role as the embarrassingly enthusiastic mother. It's like she's making up for lost time by going overboard in the opposite direction." The transformation in my mother had indeed been remarkable. From emotional distance to sometimes overwhelming involvement, from subtle criticism to effusive support. The pendulum hadn't quite found its center yet, but the effort behind the change was unmistakable and touching. As the elevator doors closed on Melissa and her family, I returned to the apartment where Hannah and Claire were finishing the breakfast cleanup. The sudden quiet felt both emptying and peaceful, the natural exhale after the energetic presence of children. "Your niece reminds me of you," Hannah observed, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "That same analytical mind, but with more confidence at her age than you had when I met you in college." I considered this comparison. "I hope so. I'd like to think she's getting the best parts of our family patterns without some of the more damaging ones." "That's how healing works? Across generations," Claire said, her artist's perspective often bringing unexpected insight. "Each new iteration gets a chance to keep what works and release what doesn't." Later that evening, after Hannah and Claire had departed and I had restored some semblance of order to my living space, I found myself drawn to my home office, the one room that still maintained its previous formality. From the bottom drawer of my desk, I removed a file labeled simply Family. Inside were the documents that had sparked this journey 18 months ago. My original revised will, created in that first flush of hurt and defiance after my mother's call. The trust fund documentation my father had finally shared with me. Copies of the Scholarship Foundation paperwork. And most recently, journal entries I had begun keeping to document this period of transformation. Reading through these materials, was like encountering a former version of myself, recognizable but increasingly distant. The hurt and anger that had fueled that first decisive action remained comprehensible, but they no longer carried the same emotional charge. They had been transformed, not erased, integrated into a more complex understanding of family dynamics and personal growth. My phone chimed with a message from Daniel. "Hope the kid weekend went well. Still on for dinner tomorrow?" I smiled, typing a quick affirmative response. This too was new, making space for romance alongside career, family, friendships, and personal interests. The Rebecca of 2 years ago would have seen a relationship as either a distraction from professional goals or a box to check on the life accomplishment list. The woman I was becoming recognized it as neither, simply one important component of a multidimensional life. The following week brought the foundation dinner, an event that had taken on increasing significance. As the program expanded, standing at the podium looking out at the gathered recipients, mentors, and supporters, I felt a momentary trepidation. Public speaking had never unnerved me in professional contexts, but this was different. This required a kind of vulnerability I was still learning to navigate. When I established this foundation 18 months ago, I began. I thought I understood exactly what I was creating and why. It was a response to a personal situation, a way of redirecting hurt into something constructive. At least that's what I told myself. I paused, looking at the young women seated at the front tables. Bright, ambitious, determined faces reflecting back a younger version of myself. What I've come to understand since then is that this foundation wasn't just about making a statement, or even about providing financial support to deserving students. It was about creating the kind of resource I wished I'd had at your age. Not just money for tuition, but a community of support, a network of mentors who understand that success has many definitions, and a space where achievement and connection can coexist rather than compete. As I continued, sharing more of my personal journey than I had originally intended, I noticed my parents seated near the back of the room. They had flown in specifically for this event, another sign of the shifting family dynamic. My mother dabbed at her eyes, while my father listened with the focused attention he had once reserved for business matters. After the formal program concluded, I moved through the room speaking with recipients and mentors, listening to their stories, witnessing the connections being formed. Zoe Hernandez, the student whose email had touched me months earlier, approached with confidence. "Ms. Miller, I wanted to introduce you to my younger sister, Maya." She gestured to the young woman beside her, a high school senior with the same determined expression. "She's interested in applying for the Foundation Scholarship next year. Your story about changing your will that night after your mother's call really resonated with her, with both of us actually. The idea that sometimes the hardest moments can lead to the most important changes." I smiled at Maya, struck by the unexpected legacy of that painful phone call, how an act born of hurt had evolved into something healing for others beyond myself. "I'd be happy to talk with you about the application process," I told her, "and about the many ways success can be defined." Later, as the event wound down, my parents approached. My mother embraced me with uncharacteristic emotion. "I'm so proud of what you've created here," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "Not just the foundation itself, but the vision behind it. You've always seen possibilities others missed." My father, less demonstrative but equally moved, added quietly, "Your grandfather would have been proud too. This is a different kind of legacy than the one he built, but no less significant." The mention of my grandfather, whose journal had helped illuminate the generational patterns that had shaped our family, felt particularly meaningful. The man who had recognized too late the damage caused by withholding approval from those most like himself would perhaps have appreciated how that recognition, finally expressed, had helped break the cycle. "Thank you for coming," I said simply. "It means a lot to have you here." As they departed for their hotel, promising to meet for brunch the following morning, I found myself reflecting on the circular nature of our journey. The mother who had once delivered the devastating news about her will was now expressing genuine pride in what that moment had ultimately created. The father who had secretly established a trust fund while watching me struggle was now openly acknowledging my accomplishments. The patterns hadn't been magically erased, but they had been recognized, examined, and gradually altered. The following morning brought another significant conversation, this one with my financial advisor and attorney. 18 months after that first reactive revision of my will, it was time for a more considered update. I'd like to maintain the foundation provisions, I explained, but with some modifications to reflect its evolution. And I want to add specific bequests for my niece and nephews, educational trusts that become available when they turn 21. My advisor nodded, making notes. And the trust fund your father established? Do you want to incorporate that into your estate planning? I had given this considerable thought. Yes, but with a specific designation. I want it to create an emergency fund for young professionals facing unexpected financial hardships, medical bills, family emergencies, situations where having a safety net makes the difference between continuing on a chosen path or having to abandon it. It felt right, transforming the money my father had set aside for when I really needed it into a resource for others facing their own moments of need. Not erasing the complicated history behind the fund, but redirecting it toward future possibility. As spring turned to summer, the family reunion my mother had been planning for months finally arrived. The setting, a rented beach house on the Oregon coast, held particular significance given our recent reconnection with the lighthouse memory from my childhood. Family members from both sides gathered, including Uncle James and his wife, cousins I hadn't seen in years, and even Carol Watson, my mother's once estranged friend who had played such a pivotal role in my awakening. Daniel accompanied me, his calm presence a welcome anchor amid the sometimes overwhelming family dynamics. He had met my parents and Melissa previously, but this was his first encounter with the extended family, a potential ordeal I had prepared him for with detailed briefings on various personalities and historical tensions. "You're handling this remarkably well," I observed as we took a morning walk along the beach on the second day. "The Miller family at full strength can be a lot to process." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "They're interesting people. Complex, certainly, but genuinely trying to connect across some pretty significant divides. That's not as common as you might think." His perspective, shaped by years of observing environmental conflicts and the human dynamics behind them, often provided clarity I lacked when too close to my own situation. "Besides," he added, "seeing you with your family helps me understand you better. The ways you're similar, the ways you've differentiated yourself, the effort you're all making to create something new without denying what came before." That afternoon, as the extended family gathered for a group photo on the beach, I found myself standing between Melissa and my mother, Daniel nearby with my father. The photographer, a cousin's teenager with artistic aspirations, directed us through various configurations, capturing not just the formal poses but the in-between moments of genuine connection. Later, reviewing the digital images, I was struck by one particular shot. Not the formal group arrangement, but a candid moment captured when most of us thought the session had ended. In it, 4 generations of Miller women were visible. My grandmother's sister in her wheelchair, my mother with her arm around her aunt, Melissa and me standing behind them, and Lily nearby with her younger cousin. Each face revealed something distinct yet connected. The same determination around the eyes, the similar tilt of the head, subtle markers of shared DNA and experience. "That's a powerful image," Daniel observed, looking over my shoulder. "You can see the continuity, but also the evolution." That evening, after a bonfire on the beach with s'mores and family stories both familiar and newly shared, Melissa and I found ourselves alone on the deck of the beach house, watching the lights of a distant ship on the horizon. "Do you ever Think about how differently things might have turned out, she asked quietly. If Mom hadn't made that call about the will, if you hadn't changed yours in response? I considered the question seriously, all the time. If she hadn't made that call, I might still be living exactly as I was, successful by external measures but missing so much of what now gives my life meaning. If I hadn't responded the way I did, we might never have broken through the roles. We were both trapped in. The golden child and the achiever, Melissa said with a wry smile. Such limiting labels for both of us. Exactly. You were just as confined by being seen as needing support as I was by being seen as not needing anything. We both lost something essential in that dynamic. She nodded, watching the distant ship disappear around a bend in the coastline. The kids talk about you all the time, you know, especially Ethan. The way you engage with him about his interests, take him seriously. It matters so much to him. He's easy to take seriously. All three of them are remarkable in their own ways. Melissa smiled, a hint of their mother's expression visible in the curve of her mouth. You know, when Mom first told me about their decision regarding the will, I didn't question it. I accepted their justification that you didn't need the inheritance like my kids did. But there was always something that felt off about it, something I couldn't quite articulate until much later. What was that? I asked, curious about her perspective on that pivotal moment. That it wasn't really about need at all. It was about maintaining a story about who we were as a family. The successful independent daughter who didn't need support, and the dependent one who did. Changing the will would have meant acknowledging that the story wasn't accurate. Maybe never had been. Her insight struck me as profound, another piece of understanding I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. The family narrative had been comfortable in its familiarity, if damaging in its impact. Changing it required not just new behaviors, but a fundamental reimagining of who we were to each other and ourselves. Well, I said finally, we're writing a new story now. All of us. The final morning of the reunion, I woke early and slipped, out for one last solitary walk along the beach. The tide was out, revealing tide pools teeming with small crabs, anemones, and starfish, complex ecosystems usually hidden beneath the water's surface. As I rounded a bend in the shoreline, the lighthouse came into view, the same one I had visited as a child, that had inspired the bracelet my parents had given me. On impulse, I changed direction, heading toward the white tower rising against the brightening sky. The visitor center wasn't open yet, but the grounds were accessible. I walked the perimeter slowly, remembering fragments of that childhood visit. My excitement at climbing the spiral staircase, the dizzying height of the lantern room, my fascination with the mechanics of the beacon. It's important to help people find their way home safely, even when there's a storm. My childish observation, repeated back to me decades later, seemed to hold layers of meaning I couldn't have understood then. We all needed lighthouses of various kinds, steady presences that illuminated paths through difficult waters, that maintained their position regardless of surrounding conditions, that operated from a place of service rather than self-interest. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth through achievement, to fill the void left by conditional approval with professional success and financial independence. But the true healing had come not from proving anything, but from reconnecting with family, with friends, with parts of myself I had long neglected in pursuit of validation. When my mother had called 18 months ago to deliver what felt like a final rejection, "We're giving everything to your sister's children," it had broken something open inside me, releasing years of accumulated hurt and resentment. Changing my will that night had been an act of defiance, of self-protection, of establishing boundaries long overdue. But what had begun as reaction had evolved into creation, the scholarship foundation that now supported young women navigating their own complex paths, the renewed family relationships built on honesty rather than prescribed roles, the multidimensional life I was still learning to embrace in all its messy, imperfect glory. As the sun rose higher, casting the lighthouse's shadow across the rocky shore, I turned back toward the beach house where my family, expanded now to include Daniel, Hannah, and Claire, the scholarship recipients who had become part of my extended circle, would soon be gathering for a final breakfast before departing for our respective homes. The inheritance my parents had once withheld now seemed almost irrelevant compared to what had ultimately been gained. Not financial assets or property, but understanding, connection, and the freedom to define success on my own terms. Not a legacy measured in dollars, but one measured in broken cycles, in new possibilities, in relationships reclaimed from the shadow of old wounds. I reached for my phone and texted Daniel. Taking a lighthouse detour. Save me coffee and tell Mom not to worry. I'm finding my way home. I smiled at the double meaning of those words as I began walking back along the shore, the strengthening sunlight illuminating pools of life where hours earlier there had seemed only stone and sand. The tide was turning, revealing what had always been there beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered when the time was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.